All right.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 19th Literacy Research to Practice show. For today, we have a very exciting show titled Struggling Readers, Using Theory to Complicate Understandings of What It Means to Be Literate in School. And we have a diverse host of panelists who've written this paper, and they're going to introduce themselves, and Dr. Alverman will be serving as the discussant as well. But in this episode, panelists will discuss how we've sought out theories that challenge deficit perspectives on students as readers and that expand the scope of research to include contextual factors that add complexity to our understanding of literacy, teaching, and learning. The authors bring together 4 theoretical approaches: new literacy studies, disability studies in education, biological systems theories, and cultural historical activity theory, in order to illuminate and interrogate the selection and use of theory as a tool for understanding conditions under which students engage in reading practices in school. Although these particular theories are grounded in distinct perspectives, the authors argue that they are united in their ability to broaden our lenses as researchers to better account for the social, cultural, and institutional factors that shape literacy, teaching, and learning in schools. In the spirit of dialogic construction of literacies, the authors hope that this discussion will serve as a catalyst to ongoing discussion and critique about the role of theory in literacy research and instruction, and in particular as it relates to students who are perceived to struggle with reading in school. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our authors and to our discussant, and they are going to introduce themselves. Katherine, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, my name's Kate Frankel. I'm an assistant professor at Boston University and very happy to be here.
I'll jump in. My name is Menika Brooks. I'm assistant professor of reading education at Texas State University, and I'm excited to be here too.
I'm Meryl Randall, and I am a faculty member at Rowan University in inclusive education.
I'm Donna Alverman at the University of Georgia. I'm a professor in the Department of Language and Literacy Education.
And we have one other author, Elizabeth Yeager at the University of Arizona. She is hopefully going to join us in just a few minutes. So we thought we would start today I wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of how we came to this topic and how we got talking about using theory to think about struggling readers in school. And then we're actually each going to talk very briefly about the theories that we've used, just so we all have a kind of a common platform as we enter into the discussion. So just as by way of background, this paper started as a result of conversations between Elizabeth Yeager and me at the University of California, Berkeley, when we were doc students, talking about how we kept seeing this term struggling reader everywhere, and it was just so frustrating. And since then, we've had so many conversations about the term and how we might be able to kind of disrupt the term. When I was at LRA in 2013, I met Meryl at a session on, I think, adolescent literacy and struggling readers, and we talked about a very similar thing. And at that same conference, I chatted with Menika about struggling readers, in particular related to English language learners. And so this kind of came together because we all realized that we really had a common purpose, but we used different tools to achieve that purpose. And because Donna has so wonderfully articulated some of these connections between theory and research, and because she also does work around struggling readers, we asked her if she would be our discussant, and she very graciously agreed for the LRA conference last year. So I'm very happy to have everybody here today. Of course, that conference session then turned into a paper, which is going to be in Literacy Research, Theory, Method, and Practice. So just before I turn it over to Menika, who will talk about the way she's used theory, I just wanted to say that there were 2 things that we really wanted to achieve in the session at LRA. One was to think about the term struggling reader, to problematize it, and to think about alternatives to it. And the other was really to think about how we can use theory to truly, what Elizabeth and I have talked about as embracing the complexity of what it means to be a reader in school. Well, really a reader anywhere, but we're focusing particularly on school and kind of what that means and what that looks like. So we started reading a little bit into the literature on, well, what do we know about how theory is used in literacy research? And Donna and her colleague have written about that, about the connection between theories and models in theoretical models and processes of reading. And Mark Dressman and Sarah McCarthy have also written about it in literacy research methodologies. And something that they wrote in their chapter in that book kind of struck me, and I think it's sort of what we're trying to achieve here with our work. They said, although the use of theoretical frames in literacy research is becoming an increasingly frequent feature of literacy research and has considerable implications for many epistemological and methodological approaches to research, it has received little direct attention or systematic scrutiny as an investigative practice. And so for us, this is really just a chance to engage with some different theories that we've been using, to maybe be a little bit critical about them, what they afford us, maybe what their limitations are, and to kind of start this conversation that we hope people who are watching will join. So with that, I want to turn it over to Menika, who is going to get us started on theory.
Okay, so I came into this looking at new literacy studies kind of by accident. I was really interested in this idea of long-term English learners and how certain students were constructed as not having any reading ability in English, and how it came to be that we saw kind of like this whole group of students being positioned as having no skills, no capabilities, or very limited skills. And so when I came across new literacy studies and literacy as a social practice, what I really liked about it is that since it positions literacy as a social thing and understanding what students or what people do with literacy, it makes the context more explicit. So rather than looking at individuals as missing something, it really focuses on how are people engaging in what they're doing, and how does the context shape whether we recognize people as being successful or unsuccessful when it comes to literacy. So I think for me, the big takeaways from literacy as a social practice is that literacy is not a skill, that literacy is not neutral, and that there are multiple literacies, and they're contextual and inherently social. And that kind of undergirded the way that I went about analyzing the literacy practices of the student that I discuss in this paper. So I think next is Meryl.
Yes. Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of an idea of where I'm coming from and how I discovered disability studies in education. As a former special ed teacher, I was always teaching students who were considered struggling readers. And during my doctoral studies, I was introduced to disability studies in education. And what that made me realize was that much of the research that I'd been reading and learning about really didn't include people who had disabilities themselves. And so one of the main affordances of disability studies is ensuring that people with disabilities are viewed as experts. Many people might say, I'm an expert on reading disabilities, but I don't think I am. I don't have one. I have never been told I have one. And so I think that during the current policy and accountability movement in schools, we focus so much on test scores that it kind of dehumanizes the students that we are hoping to support instructionally. And so through disability studies, it allows us to see both the possible downsides or tensions that being labeled with a reading disability can have on an individual. And it also challenges us to think about, what does it mean to be a struggling reader, and to recognize that it depends on where you are, who you're with, and what matters at that time.
So I think as much as I would love to be able to tell you about Elizabeth's use of Bronfenbrenner, I'm not sure that I can do it justice. So maybe we'll jump to my use of cultural historical activity theory in hopes that Elizabeth will be able to join us. So cultural historical activity theory, I was drawn to it because I always felt this tension in the literature on students who are struggling with reading for whatever reason, and as Meryl was talking about in the literature, particularly on students with reading disabilities, about this focus on kind of what was going on in the head. We know a lot about what goes on in students' heads when they read, in any reader's head when they read. And I just really wanted to find a way to think, to kind of expand beyond just that, and to take that into consideration, certainly, but to also look at the larger context in which students were reading. So I arrived at cultural historical activity theory by way of this distinction between remediation and remediation with a hyphen. And the difference here is an argument that Mike Cole and Peg Griffin made way back in 1983, where they said, we often think about students who are struggling with reading in terms of remediation, sort of like a medical model, that there's something wrong with them in their heads and we kind of need to provide treatment in order to fix it. And they proposed an alternative vision, which was this idea of remediation with a hyphen, where the root there is the word mediate. And so it sort of takes a step back, and rather than focusing on kind of what's going on in the student's head that needs to be fixed, it's a step back to say, well, what's going on in the activity that we're doing with students, in the reading activities in which we engage. Screen with you for a second, because I think unless you're familiar with cultural historical activity theory, it's sort of hard to see. So hopefully you can see. Can everybody see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so it's sort of a lot of moving parts, but basically that top of the triangle, where we're looking at the student, the tools, and the object. The idea in their idea of remediation is that it's really focusing on those tools. What can we do? How can we change our instruction? What kind of activities can we kind of engage students in, so that when we're talking about reading, it's always in the context of comprehension and the importance of kind of interpreting the world, not just about reading something fluently or kind of reading aloud. It's more about, well, what kind of meaning are we taking away from it, and how can we structure activities so that students kind of understand the value of reading beyond that immediate task in school. And so for me, that was incredibly helpful in thinking about just kind of have to have a tool for thinking about what are those contextual factors that are important to consider. And so I guess at this point, I'll turn it over to Donna, who's just going to briefly talk about kind of some of the things that she's seen coming out of these discussions about theory. And I'll just say that as a whole, when I think about these theories and my conversations with my co-authors, I really think that they've challenged the struggling reader label, because the way we've looked at readers through these theories has really helped us to see that there's a lot going on, and that it's not, you can't always explain something by kind of what a student can and can't do as like a sort of a general objective thing. And so I'm looking forward to hearing Donna's thoughts as somebody who really has thought long and hard about the use of theory, and particularly she and her colleague have talked about how theory can move us further in understanding issues, but they also, at the same time, theory can kind of add complications and be perplexing as we think about literacy and reading processes. So Donna, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kate. First of all, I would say that this is an important paper or article for the yearbook, in the sense that I can tell by all four of you coming together in terms of giving reasons and rationales for why you are choosing a particular theory to frame your study, that this will help immensely in my courses that I teach on campus. And if there are other literacy educators listening, I am sure that you're thinking the same thing. This article will become like a base for getting people to think about it. Because what you do is, which I like, is you link this theory with what you wanted to do that nobody else, I shouldn't say nobody, that few people have done with participants in the past who are struggling readers, okay? And you said that you are going to use theory to help you understand, hopefully to improve a theory and actually add to, of course, to the research base. I like to think of theories as, my colleague and I, Norm Unruh, like to think of theories as a vehicle with its headlights on. And what that allows us to do is to actually see what where we're going. At least we initially think help us see where we're going, and I think it also helps us to focus on what it is that we want to learn from our study. And I find that when people get lost at a dissertation level and start meandering, I'll say, go back to your theory. What is it showing you to do? And that usually gets them back on the road again. And the last thing I like about theories with the idea of a vehicle with its headlights on is that it allows people to see how that destination is reached. In other words, the significance of that study. And I find from reading your papers when I was a discussant at LRA a year ago, that really did show you much of, it answered your questions, first of all, from the research study, but it also showed you what was significant about the original question you asked, which was, how does all of this tie into struggling reader, and do we have to continue using that word or that label?
Thanks, Donna. One of the things that I think that maybe we want to do is sort of open the discussion then back up with some questions. And one of the things that this group framed early as key questions overall was, what are the affordances and constraints of the theories we utilize in our research? And I was wondering if the panel could talk a little bit more, because in the paper you use, the way I really like the way you frame in the paper is, here's the theory, and now here's the example of how we're applying the theory. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you saw as affordances and constraints of the particular theory you used, with maybe an example or two from the research that you conducted. And it's open to anyone to jump in. But
I think.
Oh, go ahead. No, Maneka, you go ahead.
Okay. I think that for me, what is really powerful that that Brian Street with this idea of literacy and social practice really brought forth to me is for students that are classified as English learners, their literacy test scores are so fundamental in whether they're considered proficient in English. And it's often something that's not questioned. If a student performs low on a standardized assessment and they're an English learner, it's assumed that it's automatically because they don't know English. And that one isolated test score is seen as a descriptor for their entire performance across a variety of possible activities and readings, different situations that within themselves have different affordances and constraints. And so what I saw that New Literacy Studies and the idea of literacy as a social practice really brings to understanding English learners is that you can't just take isolated test scores and make judgments about an entire student's ability, that you really have to look more closely at who the student is as a person, what are their experiences with literacy. It could be an issue of language, but if so, how does language play into this discussion? So I feel that it really pushes back against the tendency to use a test score to predict an entire person's reading abilities or literacy abilities more broadly. And in particular, in the student that I looked at, understanding her day-to-day experience with literacy raises a lot of questions as to what the test scores were actually measuring, given what she was asked to do in the classroom.
And maybe I can jump right in there, Maneka, because the student that I talked about using cultural historical activity theory was labeled an English learner, and his score on the ELA portion of the state standards test was the reason why he was in a reading intervention classroom in the first place. And so it just so happened that this classroom, the teacher had a very kind of incredible and exciting and personally relevant to the students' idea of what literacy is. And so there was some really interesting things, kind of exciting things that happened for the student in terms of thinking about his ability to do the reading in school. But so even though there was some cultural historical activity theory gave me a lens to see some positive things in terms of what were the objectives of the class and what were the outcomes for this student in terms of his reading outside of school with his sister, his reading of graphic novels extensively because he's an artist and wanted to not just read the books but also to see how different artists were depicting images. So these were all kind of exciting things that happened in the class, but the fact of the matter was it was a class for students who supposedly were really struggling readers. And for him, there were certain areas that he had difficulty with reading. Certainly his biology class, for example, the vocabulary in his biology class was very challenging, and he talked about that, and I observed him in that class and saw some of those difficulties. But to say that he's a struggling reader and kind of doesn't have reading skills in broad terms is incredibly incorrect, and I think really does a disservice to him and who he is. And so some of actually the way my future work is moving is to think about much more situated literacy. So what is literacy look like in a science classroom, in a history classroom? What goes on in those contexts more specifically, and how can we support students in those contexts? And I know that others have been doing that work as well. So, but I really appreciate Menika's point that this idea of a standardized test kind of dictating whether you're a struggling reader or not, and then knowing from my experiences with research with the students that I've worked with that it has very real consequences. The student was in a class all year long, didn't take an elective because of this test, and he had a pretty wonderful teacher, but that's not a guarantee for sure. And what we know about kind of remediation and literacy interventions broadly, that's definitely not always the case. So.
Okay, well, I can take over. One of the things that I think was really helpful to me was realizing that special education, which is traditionally and remains dominated by quantitative research, so often large-scale studies, and so often I wonder, you know, when you see research suggesting that an intervention wasn't successful because students didn't make gains, it was hard to make sense of it and understand why. And so I found that I've learned more as both a teacher educator and as a literacy researcher from doing interviews with individuals who have been identified as struggling readers or could be identified as struggling readers or have identified reading disabilities. I've learned more that is actually really helpful to practice into understanding you know, what additional challenges exist for them, you know, so looking at, you know, assumptions. So for some individuals, being labeled with a reading disability might be helpful to them. It might help them to recognize that they do have, that they are smart and they are capable. For others, it might have the opposite effect. And it might stigmatize them and be problematic to them. But one thing that I think, and I interviewed a college student named Mari about who self-identified as having a reading disability and who is an outstanding student. She's an honor student. She was had a 4.0, I think, at the time of the interviews I conducted. And it's just, it's quite ironic that she is also labeled with a reading disability, although she is a really successful student. And as we all know, in college, most of content is learned through reading and writing. And so I just found it interesting that she was, what this label did and how it positioned her in certain situations. And the fact that on top of, you know, navigating college and, you know, learning in classes, she also had to navigate, you know, living with a reading disability label and deciding who to tell, who not to tell, in what situations were things assumed that she had a disability, and in others, people may becoming aware of stereotypes that existed about what having a disability means.
Meryl, I wonder if you would just really briefly tell that one anecdote about Marie and where she worked on campus.
At the Disability Resource Center?
Right. So my understanding was that her job was to read text aloud to provide accommodations for other students who needed that accommodation, but that she also had that accommodation. Is that
right?
Correct?
So she was part of the Honor Society, and one of the service requirements of being a part of the Honor Society was that she, along with the other individuals starting freshman year, would volunteer at the Disability Research, the Disability Center at the university. And so she was already familiar with it because she had gone there in order to get specific accommodations and to have her reading disability recognized by the university. But I think a very interesting experience that has is that when she showed up and they were, she and the other honor students were being introduced to the staff members at the Disability Center, that somebody said, you know, does anybody know someone with a disability? And she thought to herself, well, I have a disability, but that's a strange thing to say. Do I acknowledge that or do I not? But, you know, unpacking that a little, the assumption that because these are all honor students, it's not possible for any of them themselves to have a disability, you know, it is made clear. And there are several instances in which she shared experiences like that, whether it's friends questioning her disability because she was so successful in school and was an honor student. And so it just added an extra layer, but it is something that without, you know, using a disability studies approach, I don't think I would have been looking for or recognized.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that story really gets at this larger concern that I have, and I think that you all share, although correct me if I'm wrong, where I think one of the problems with terms like struggling reader is that it's very monolithic. So as soon as we say you're a struggling reader, then there's sort of an assumption that permeates all aspects of life. So you can't have a reading disability and be an honor student. You can't be a struggling reader and also engage in all these rich literacy practices in other parts of your life. And so for me, the theories, by saying things, and I think Menika spoke to this too, by thinking about literacy as contextualized. So yes, the student that I worked with, Nicholas, had a very difficult time with the reading that he did in his biology class. But that doesn't mean that he didn't do other things with reading in other contexts that are very much not kind of what you imagine a struggling reader would be able to do. And to me, that complexity, trying to capture that complexity and not define students by a test score or a label or a disability is so important. Especially, and we're talking about implications soon, especially in thinking about what that means for instruction.
Yeah, and that's something that's been coming up a lot for me in a course I teach on literacy and diversity, because people often, I feel like when they use the term struggling reader, it's almost as a euphemism for them to address issues of race and language diversity without really kind of like treading on those topics. And so it's interesting when you ask them, when I ask people when they either people who are writing articles or teachers in practice or people in school, when you say struggling reader, who are you talking about and what exactly are they struggling with? Then like getting people to speak with specificity is harder because they're like, well, no, they don't really struggle with everything. It's just this, or it's test scores, or it's this that I'm actually talking about. So I wonder if kind of pushing in, how does the way we talk about reading theoretically influence how we engage in reading in a practical level and also talk about others as readers implicitly, even if we're not necessarily, everyone's not able to articulate the actual theoretical perspective that may kind of undergird the way they look at reading and practice.
And I think also, Menika, that the long-term English learner that you worked with, which was a new term that I learned actually from you. I just somehow imagined, since that's not my area of study, that somehow when everything had happened right at school, these English learners were just like all fixed. Okay. And I don't know that I believe in anything or anybody being fixed, but it was like, oh well, that's one last thing to worry about. But when I listened to your talk or read about your person you worked with, I remember that sometimes people in my class and the university, my undergrad class, may be one of these long-term English learners. So I became very practically informed from your research, which was looking at the what do people really do with these literacy practices, which is very much a part of the new literacy studies. And the other thing that I'm thinking of in terms of Meryl's research, with the young woman who actually went in and out of accepting her label, and how much that's going to, that finding, Meryl, I think, may actually lead to something that will have to be tweaked in the DSE, Disability Studies and Education, theoretical literature. Because what I've seen so far, I don't necessarily see that being addressed. In other words, it's usually the critique of what's happened to people who have been labeled with a disability, with dis in parentheses. But then people, the research that I'm reading rather, leaves it at that, and it doesn't go further to say, as Kate actually commented on earlier when she first started, we may have some things that we want to talk about that we would challenge the theory as it now stands. And Kate, since you brought that up, do you have anything that you would challenge chat on as a result of working with Nicholas?
Oh, that's a great question, an important question. So I think one of the things that I didn't really get into, that's where sort of chat has been moving, is thinking about these different activity systems. So I showed you that, here, I'll bring it, maybe I won't. I'll bring it really quickly back just so I can, I showed you this, this image before, and thinking about all the different, so this triangle itself is sort of an activity system, but thinking about all the other activities and activity systems that influence this one, right? And how, so the if you look and see the objective of maybe one activity or one class experience, how that then maps on to other experiences that students are engaged in. And so in my example with Nicholas, how does what happens in that class, that reading class, map on to the activities in which he's engaged in his biology classroom, at home, and really thinking about expanding and looking at those sort of across activities.
Right.
And that's certainly where I think where the field is going, and has gone and is going. But it gets really complex when you start thinking about that, and I think there actually are some models in that in that theoretical models and processes, or maybe it's one of the reading research handbooks, but where Donna, you and Elizabeth Moji tried to kind of model that complexity, and it gets really crazy really fast. I show my I wish I had a picture. I show my students the model. What does a classroom really look like? What does a student's experience really look like? And it gets very complex very quickly when you start thinking about all these different areas in which students are engaged. So I think it's taking what's complex and kind of using theory to make things complex, and then thinking about how can we kind of make it even more complex, but in a way that is understandable and actually has practical implications for, well, when we have a student in class who is having difficulty with that reading, what do you do?
Yeah,
I don't know if I answered your question.
you did, and I'm thinking as you were talking to me about it and showed the image again, how true this would be of almost everybody, including Elizabeth's paper portion of the paper that I had read, and that is that I think we're always very interested in terms of what a theory can do for us. But I'm seeing, as a person looking from the outside in who didn't do any of these studies, that it's what you, the researchers, can do for a theory too. So I hear Kate saying maybe it's time to complexify the chat. It's already complex, as you showed, but maybe even staying within chat, Kate, not going outside of it. And I would say the same for Monica and for Meryl, saying within your theoretical frame that you chose, but how could you just, I'm not asking you, and I did ask Kate, but that was a hard question, and I hadn't really broached it with her earlier, but I think that she was showing me, at least, that it's complexity that needs to be up the ante rather on in terms of complexity theory. So if you start talking to that sort of direction that you're going to when you're at conferences, etc., I could see people saying, all right, I do chat, but I had never thought of this or whatever. And that's what will move our field forward in the sense of theoretical framing. If you who are doing work in that area see how it almost satisfied and directed what you wanted to do, but when you found out what you had, now you realize you need more about complexity within your particular frame, not just chat. And I don't know what Meryl's and Monica's notion would be on that. But thank you.
So I can say something about that. I think that in hindsight, recognizing that by looking only using disability studies frame, I didn't look at the intersectional nature of the reality of disability. So the individual that I studied was a white woman who had grown up in an upper middle class neighborhood, and that wasn't something that I brought into this paper. However, in the current research that I'm doing, working more in terms of discrit, and so looking at the intersections of race and socioeconomic status and gender and disability is something that has helped to move me forward, because I think that one of the questions I've been asked is in my current research, which is with young people, 10 to 12-year-olds, is do the students, do they have disabilities? And my answer is I don't know, and does it matter? And I've had some pushback on that as someone who's coming from a special education graduate program and tries to navigate the fields of special education and literacy studies. And so sometimes that might, without a disability label, sometimes the work is not is questioned a bit more in terms of how it relates to disability studies. Although we know that there are many disproportionate there's a lot of research suggesting that certain individuals from certain, for example, from urban schools are disproportionately identified as having reading disabilities and in special education because of it. So, I think that just adding on the complexity and not limiting ourselves to one framework can be really helpful. And I mean, I think in reading Monica's paper, the full one that's in the Research in the Teaching of English, I found that really interesting when she talks about the difference between how students learn in school, or how they read in school, and then what their expectations are on standardized tests, and how it's night and day. In school they're reading together, they're talking, they're discussing, and then in standardized tests they're on their own, it's silent. And there's one answer. And so I have found a lot of value in reading the work of everybody that contributed to this, because it's there are things that have made me, I've had a lot of aha moments. And I think it's really helpful to kind of bring each of these pieces together and to identify some of their similarities, some of their differences. And it really has pushed us to think about, how to use theory and, what is a struggling reader, and is that even a helpful term?
Yeah, and so I think for me, it kind of reminds me of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TED Talk, when she talks about the powers of stories to uplift and the power of stories to malign. And that's kind of how I think about theory. And in particular, when we think about the way that specific kinds of theory have been applied to groups that have been marginalized, whether it's racially, linguistically, culturally, by perceived disability status. And so I guess for me, what new literacy studies, what literacy as a social practice allows for me to do theoretically is to say that these individuals are capable people and look at what they can do and look at what all of the things that they're doing that are awesome. And so the question is, and I think all of these theories are united in the fact that show that people who are positioned as being consistently struggling are capable. So then I think it really allows, when it connects back to practice, what could we do in the classroom to create environments where people are having the opportunity to be successful, one, and to learn the different kinds of practices that they're required to demonstrate, to show other people that they are capable in other ways too. And I think for me, working with future teachers and myself as a teacher who encounters linguistically and culturally diverse students in my own classrooms, I think it comes down to how do we understand these students as people, and I think that sometimes struggling readers, because of all the, like Graf would say, all the mythologies of literacy that are associated with, often they get constructed as having, intellectual, we talk about teaching students critical thinking skills rather than teaching students maybe how to demonstrate their critical thinking skills in ways that other people will recognize as critical thinking, And so I think that theory has a huge role in framing how we see students, and I think that really influences how we work with students. Because if you see reading as a skill, then you're just going to focus on, drilling students in skills until they get it. Whereas if you see it as a practice, you could think of, how am I going to engage my students in the learning practice that would kind of facilitate this? And I don't know if I'm looking at the show notes, and someone asked, what is a better term? And I thought that was an interesting question. So I don't know if I have some thoughts, but I'll let someone else talk first.
So you're referring to what might be as a result of your analyses through these theoretical lenses, what might be a term that
yeah, because if struggling reader is a problem, what are the alternative ways of referring to people or talking about this? The question that was written was just, what is a better term? But I assume that's what the person was getting at through what they were asking. So.
Yeah, I added that as we were talking because I've always wanted a better term than struggling reader. And for me, I wonder, I don't know if this is going to answer the question, but for me, it goes back to that theoretical framework I was talking about, this distinction between remediation and remediation with a hyphen. It's somehow it has to be about not looking in to the reader to say what's wrong, and instead stepping back and saying, what can I do to achieve the goals I want for this student? What's my role in that? So how can, as a teacher, and when I think about this working with my future teachers now, even as a teacher educator, how can I as a teacher do this better or address the needs of this particular student better, because it's not about them, a problem in them, it's kind of just about, well, this approach, this activity isn't really working the way I thought it would, so I might need to think about how to reframe this or go back again. And so for me, when we think about implications, and I'm so happy to have this conversation, it's so important at the K-12 level and also for those of us who are teacher educators, because it should always be a process of, okay, here's my goal for my students in the chat framework, here's my objective for my students, Is this what they see as the objective? Is this what's actually happening? What's the outcome? Is what I'm hoping happening actually happening? If not, then as a teacher, what's my role in reshaping this so that we can kind of achieve these things together? And so that doesn't answer your question, Manika, or doesn't answer that question. But I think it gets at this. Well, where are we locating the conversation?
Mm-hmm.
And I would just add, and again, in my current research working with much younger individuals, one of the interesting things that I have found is I've done interviews with them about their reading histories. And what's interesting to me is that all of them talk about areas of struggle in learning to read. And so that's been helpful to me to realize that learning to read is hard. Learning to read is emotional, and that even the students that we may meet with in college who have been successful and are in a teacher education program, they may have had a year or two where they really felt challenged with reading. And so I think that that's something I've been thinking about that's helped me to move it forward. And I think also, I know Elizabeth often uses the term vulnerable reader. And that has been, I think that's Randy Boehmer's term.
Right.
And that has been somewhat helpful to me because I can identify reasons outside of the individual that might make the individual vulnerable, be it the school that the individual goes to, where he or she lives, and the type of instruction that they're receiving in school. And so while I don't think that it answers the question and is the perfect term, I feel like I like it better.
Yeah.
Well, you like vulnerable reader better. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I also wonder if it's the thing that I struggle with at times is whatever term you use to describe a stigmatized group eventually becomes a negative term. So I could think of, the evolution of terms like imbecile and idiot and retarded and all of these words that are now negative things at one point were seen as the correct terms, a nicer way of referring to a stigmatized group. So I wonder if there ever is going to be a term that will be good enough. And then the other part that I struggle with terms is that if reading is situational, then you have to be specific when you're talking about what someone's doing with text or with literacy or with images at a particular point in time. And I wonder if there really is ever a term that describes that. And I know that we've talked about earlier when you're writing about these things, it's a real struggle because journal articles have word limits. And so if you do try to be situational in your language, then you end up going over word limits and you end up having to cut to use these shorthand terms. And it's the same thing in day-to-day practice. It's easier to say EL students or, struggling readers than really talking with nuance about what it is. So I wonder, terms are necessary, but I'm not sure if there's ever going to be a better term per se.
Well, Manika, I just want to flag the fact that the title of our article has the word struggling reader in it. There's a question mark after it.
Yeah.
But I remember having conversations with several of you about this, and I hated, given what the paper is, having to use that term, but you also have to be able to talk to other people who are talking about it, right? Who are using the term that if you don't you have to sort of buy in enough to join the conversation.
Right.
And it's this tension. And I wonder, I don't know, Donna, if you'd be willing to share your efforts to change the term. You had told me about trying to change it to striving readers and how it no one understood what you were talking about.
Yeah, I remember that story. I was working overseas in a 13 country study of quote, struggling readers. It was a European term that they liked. So at that point, I was pushing against that term and mentioned at a meeting that could we think of them maybe as striving readers? And I said that, and this may have been my mistake, I said, and the U.S. government is actually has some documents out now about striving readers. I think if I had said, not maybe connected it with U.S. or whatever, it would have might have gone over better, but it was out there. And people looked at me and they said, but we wouldn't have gotten this big grant that has now gone into several other large grants without that label, because that's the hot word for it right now. So, Manica, I'm with you in the sense of I've about given up trying to think of something different, because as soon as you substitute it, people will it'll again move toward that negative end because you're stigmatizing. So it's the process, as you were saying, that is what's negative, not necessarily the term. And I don't know how to fix that either, or even give any suggestions. But I do know that now in the European context too, it was like, no, we don't want striving, we want struggling. So that was it.
So where do all of you see your work going then as a result of taking these specific theoretical approaches and knowing that the goal is to not stigmatize struggling readers, but to look at the process? Where do you see each of your work moving, and what are some of those implications for your future research and for the field itself?
So I can jump in. I mentioned earlier that my past research, I actually intentionally chose to work in literacy intervention contexts, so classes where students were placed in those classes because of a multitude of reasons, oftentimes standardized test scores, as I came to find out. And what my work, even though I worked with students I kind of went with them to their other classes so that I could kind of get a better understanding of what was going on, I think I need to move away from those classes, because no matter what I do, I can't escape what they are and how they position students. And I've used identity theory and positioning theory and other work related to this research to really think about that, and to think about how we position students in those contexts. And for me as a researcher, what I came to realize was that a lot of what I was doing as a researcher, even though it was the exact opposite of what I intended, was further positioning them. And so I'm thinking about, as many others are, I'm thinking about literacy in the content areas, and I'm looking particularly at how we can use text in content areas to kind of bolster student agency is kind of where I'm looking, and to not kind of focus on these very particular intervention contexts, but to think about a much broader lay of the land, I guess.
But I wonder, based on what you wrote and what you've been saying, Kate, that it might also include like a reimagining of what an intervention class looks like. So we sort of, like, people, at least in the field, maybe take for granted, like, well, this is what the reading intervention needs to look like because here's the manual, here's the program, or things like that. But it seems like what you're illuminating through your perspective using chat is that maybe the whole activity system itself needs to be re-examined or reimagined.
Sure, and actually the larger research was looking at two different classes that had really different structures, and none, I wouldn't say one's kind of just like in any way better than another. It's very different, and the outcomes were very different for students. And I totally agree with you, but I think that even reimagining that if you're thinking about kind of the activity system of a class, it needs to be more than that, and this gets back to what I said to Donna about the complexity piece, because I don't think it can happen in a reading class, and that's kind of the conundrum for me, is to have a class like that does too much damage, just in terms of what it is and what it's saying about students who are in it. even if it's the greatest instruction in the world and the teacher's the most amazing person in the world and students are reading a lot, they all know they're in that class because they've been labeled a struggling reader.
Mm-hmm.
So going along the same lines, in my current research, I have been working in a youth development program that's out of school and in an inclusive space. So I'm working with students who, if you look at their test scores, range from, many years above grade level to below grade level. And the benefit of not being in school is there are less labels. Or individuals get to choose, their labels or whether or not to disclose or not disclose labels. But I found that that's something that both as a researcher and also as an instructor, because I've been working in a book club in the out-of-school program and co-instructing. And I found that to be a really, really liberating experience. And again, as someone who was a reading interventionist for much of my K-12 teaching career. And so that's kind of where I've moved my research, but I have definitely shifted my thoughts about, how to measure progress and what that looks like. And that's something I also bring into my teacher education courses. So, talking about kid watching or having conversations with students. You can learn a lot from having conversations with students about what they read that you don't learn from a book report. And so just kind of rethinking assessment and rethinking, making sure the student is included in your understanding of them as a reader.
I love that, Meryl. Especially the idea that we don't have to have grand theories or even medium level theories like being discussed today, that all of us as teachers are theorizing, whether we realize it or not, almost every hour of the day when we are working with students and on our way home thinking, if I had tried that or whatever. So to get away from the stigma, I guess, of using theory, like theory separated from practice, that's not such a problem anymore. And I think it's because people like you are doing, all of you on this show, are doing studies that are so closely related to the classroom, and you're talking about your theories rather than just stating them and then going on and leaving them. I really like that approach.
And I think for me, I would say I'm really focusing on this idea of challenging deficit theories about students that are belong to groups that have been stigmatized. So I'm really I would say that there's a lot of interesting things going around in the study of bilingualism and language that is very disconnected from people who consider themselves to be literacy researchers. And so what I'm really trying to do in my research now is really kind of bring together the newer views on bilingualism that are going on in like the study of societal bilingualism and individual bilingualism and collect that with literacy and explicitly talk about race. And I think all of these things I try to do in my teacher education classes as well, because I think it's really important we think of who do we imagine in our mind when we think of as struggling readers, and how does those images in our mind influence the way we interact with students and how we interpret one student as, oh, they're just struggling with this particular assignment, and then for another student have it be indicative of who they are as a reader in general. So I think that's something that kind of is informing my work. Like there's a lot of new research about like racio-linguistic ideologies, like Flores and Rosas are talking about these ideas, and then new ways of looking at bilingualism and all this stuff. So that's really kind of informing my instruction as well as my ongoing research. But then, as usual, there's kind of rigid language ideologies that are within the structures of teacher education. So another thing that I'm thinking about is how to negotiate pushing back against these ideas that are inherent to technically what students have to learn to achieve a degree. So making sure that they have that kind of like what's now seen as canonized knowledge, while pushing back against it at the same time, so you don't kind of like reproduce through teacher education the things that I'm trying to fight against in my actual research. And so those are the kind of those are the ideas that are going around in my head that I'm wrestling with as I continue my new research projects and my activities as an educator at the university level.
Well, this has been a fabulous discussion, and being a month out from LRA, excited to hear these conversations continue at the conference in San Diego. And many thanks to Kate, Manica, Elizabeth, and Meryl for writing this paper. And I'd like to echo what Donna had said at the beginning. I really do think this is a paper that many of us will be able to use in our coursework and pushing on theory. So encourage people to read this article in Theory, Methods, and Practice. This broadcast will be housed on YouTube. This is also something that I've used these broadcasts, and I'm excited to share this with my students. So many thanks to all of you. Thanks to Donna for providing insights and probing questions, and look forward to seeing you all at LRA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.